Welcome to the EFC webinar. My name is Karen Stiller and I'm a senior editor with Faith Today magazine. We're so happy to have you here with us today, and we're very excited about this topic. Our webinar today is on church and faith trends in Canada, which is clearly a topic that interests us all. Our presenter is Rick Hiemstra. He's the Director of Research and Media Relations for the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. Rick's specialty is research into church trends, and he has a lot of light to shed for us today on this topic. During the presentation, you'll see a question and answer box. Please use that. Send us your questions, and Rick will interact with them at the end of the presentation. If you are interested in webinars, please visit our website at theefc.ca/webinars, and you can access ones we've already done that are recorded there and also find out about what's coming up. So without further ado, here is Rick, and thank you for coming.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at mostly sociological statistics. We're going to focus in on affiliation, attendance, and other demographic data to see what we can learn about how the church is changing over time. So I'm going to start in by looking at affiliation data. So just a second, my slide is not advancing here. Dave, there we go. So when we look at religious affiliation, this is one of the measures that we have of religious commitment. And when we're dealing with religious commitment, this is, if we think of religious commitment as a ladder, this is sort of the lowest rung on the ladder. And so this is where people say, this is my church, but they don't necessarily participate. And we have two different kinds of data on this chart. And I'm just going to use this marker here to show. So here on the chart, we've got on this side here, you've got Angus Reid data, and this is public opinion data. On the other side, we have what I'm calling census data. It includes another piece of data here called the National Household Survey that was in 2011, which isn't quite like a census, but because it was taken at the same time, I've included it in the same group. Here on the chart, we've got blue, which represents Catholics. And so we've got light blue for French Catholics and a darker blue for English-speaking Catholics. The red represents mainline Protestant denominations, so that would typically be the United Church, Anglican denominations, Presbyterians, and Lutherans. The green represents evangelicals. Orange here is other Christians. The gray is those with no or of other religions, so that would be Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, etc. And then we've got another group here that say they have no religion. So I want you to see we're starting in 1996 with the poll here. All of these polls looked at about 3,000 Canadians, and you can see that some of the changes is we've got this big growth here in the percentage of Canadians that are saying that they have no religious affiliation whatsoever. And that is a big change. I want you to pay attention here to this gap between 2003 and 2007. As we go along, I'm going to be referring to a shift that has happened in this place where you're going to see a shift. And one of the manifestations of that shift you see here is this big growth in those with no religion. Let's look on the other side now for a minute. I'm going to pull that arrow across. And on this side, you can see that I've got the same colors for the different traditions, except the Catholics are all in one color of blue because the data sets that I had didn't allow me to split them out according to whether they were French or English-speaking Catholics. One of the reasons that it was important to do that back here is because, as we'll see, Catholicism went through something called the Quiet Revolution in Quebec in the 1960s, where Quebec went from one of the most religious jurisdictions in North America to the least religious jurisdiction in about a space of a decade. And so I tried to do that here. Over here, you're going to notice that when people talk to the census takers, that they are more likely to say that they're Roman Catholic. Now, some of this plays into the strengths and weaknesses of different kinds of polls. So For instance, here on the Angus Reid side, you're talking to a public opinion pollster. On this side, you're talking to the government. And when we do polling, any kind of polling, we're always looking for data that's representative, but all data has strengths and weaknesses. And one of the weaknesses in all kinds of polling is that people tend to give something that they call give into something called desirability bias. And what we mean by that is you tend to try to give the answers that you figure people want to hear. Now, I think some of what's going on in the difference here is that there's some of that different kinds of bias that are making people more likely to tell the government when they do a census that they're Catholic and less likely to talk to a pollster over here and tell them that they're Roman Catholic. Nevertheless, I want to point to a couple of other shifts that we've seen. Here in the 1980s, about a third of Canadians said they were mainline Protestant. Down in 2011, that was down to about 14%. Evangelicals have kind of held, and then we have this big growth here in those with no religion. Now, we always sort of wonder how good are the polls here, and we've talked about some of the differences between what the results we get for Catholics in an Angus Reid poll versus what you would get over on a census. But I want you to see too that aside from the Catholics, some of these numbers match up. If we look just at the 2013 data for the Angus Reid, and then we look at the 2011 data for the National Household Survey, a lot of the answers are lining up pretty closely, and certainly within what we would call the margin of error. So let's go on to the next slide. Next slide, we're going to look at attendance. And remember, we said that if religious commitment was a ladder, affiliation is the bottom rung on the ladder, and then the next rung on the ladder would be attendance of some kind. And the data that you have on the screen here, every one of these dots here represents a national poll that was taken sometime between the end of the Second World War and the last one would have been in 2013 on this map, on this chart. The red dots represent mostly Gallup polls, and Gallup asked a question, have you attended religious services in the last 7 days? So these Gallup tended to ask this right around Easter, and so this would have probably been the high point in the year. A little bit later on, we started asking a question about the frequency of religious attendance, and people would then give you whether they attended a couple times a week or once a month. But the overall trajectory since the Second World War has been a downward slope, in spite of the fact that around this point in time you might get the odd poll that showed that things were going up. This is the overall trend. Probably right now we have about 13% of Canadians who attend a religious service on a weekly basis, and that's all religious services, not just Christian services. Here we're looking at 4 Angus Reid polls here, and again, it's how often did you attend religious services in the last 12 months is what's on the chart here, and the blue represents at least weekly, the orange represents monthly or a few times a month. The gray represents at least a few times, at least yearly, but less than monthly. And then the gray is never. And so I want you to see, here's our trend line. I want you to look again in this place here between 2003 and 2013. Something happened to make attendance fall off dramatically. And the most significant thing is this group up here in the circle where you see that those who never attended church in the last 12 months has gone up dramatically from what you would have seen in 2003. Now, we have these two numbers here that are between 2013 to 2014. Those polls are very close together. And what happened is that we did this poll in 2013 with Angus Reid, and we saw that there was such a dramatic drop, we thought, could we have a bad poll? And we all know from watching some of the political polling come out that occasionally pollsters do get it wrong. And so we went back to Angus Reid and they did the polling for us again, and we got almost identical numbers here, which tells us that there has been some kind of significant and real shift. If we look at this same data and now we're comparing 1996 and 2003 for the different traditions, and the traditions that we have here: French Catholic, English Catholic, mainline Protestant, Evangelical, and those with no Christian affiliation whatsoever. And we're looking at how things have changed. And again, the blue here represents at least weekly. The orange represents monthly or a few times a month. And then we have the less often in the different shades of gray. Here's the trend line. And I've put these red arrows here just at weekly service attendance. I'm doing that on purpose. We could have decided to put them any other place, but we know from all kinds of sociological studies that there is a difference between those who attend religious services weekly and less often. That means that those who attend a few times a month are more like those that attend rarely than they are like those who attend weekly. And you can see that for all of the groups, the frequent church attendance has fallen, but it's fallen quite dramatically if you look at the Catholic and the mainline numbers. Again, these are among their affiliates. So for instance, in the mainline churches, only 10% of the people who say they belong to a mainline church attend at least weekly in 2013. I just want to introduce some terminology here. We're going to have a few slides that will use sociological generation language to describe different age groups. And so the greatest generation is the oldest, and these were the ones that were born between 1901 and 1924. We have the silent generation that were born between 1925 and just the end of the Second World War. We're the baby boomers, 1946 to 64, Gen X, which is where I would fall between 1965 and 1981, and then Gen Y. All of these surveys dealt with adults rather than, we didn't have any children just because it's harder to do survey work with children. So that's something you can keep in mind as some of a limitation of the data as we go ahead. So if we use these sociological generations and we look at our data from 2013, when we ask how often did you attend religious services, you can see that the silent generation is far more likely to be in church than the other generations. We saw in a chart previously that it seemed like there's a long-term downward trend. But what gives me hope that that downward trend might be bottoming out is you can see that whether you go from the boomers to Gen X to Gen Y, that they're all still about 10% are attending at least weekly. So it's not going down with the different generations. I've just got to know that I've got to speed up a little bit. So I will, we're looking here again at the comparison of religious affiliation and attendance. And so on this pie chart over on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see that we're showing the breakdown of religious affiliation in the poll that we took in 2013. And you can see that the biggest group here is those with no Christian affiliation. So we thought, what would we see if we weighted those people, that affiliation by attendance? So what I did is I said, if you say attended on a weekly basis, there's 52 weeks in a year, I gave you a score of 52. And if you attended once a month or 12 months in a year, I gave you a score of 12, and so on. And then I said, in terms of all the attending, if we could look at it all at once, we can see that evangelicals here are doing about a third of the attending, and Catholics 24%, etc. So there's a very different picture, for instance, if you look at affiliation versus attendance. And again, that's the difference between different kinds of religious commitment. What happens if you look at that same data and limit it to the younger part of our sample? Again, you can see that in the younger part of the sample, the percentage of the population with no Christian affiliation goes up. But if we then go and look at attendance, you have evangelicals doing about 2/5 of all the attendance at religious services in Canada. Whereas a group like the mainline churches now only doing about 5% of the religious service attendance. Very different trajectories. We'll go through this next couple of slides fairly quickly. I just want to show you how the different traditions are aging. And in this one, we have Catholic affiliation. That puts French and English-speaking Catholics together. But I want you to see, if we draw a line here across the group that is in 24 to 44 age range, and so we've got the older age ranges represented at the top of the chart, the younger at the bottom. You can see that Catholics are aging, and they're aging maybe just a little bit faster than the Canadian population. This is census data in 1991, 2001, and 2011. And if we look at mainline Protestants, again drawing a line at the same place, you can see that mainline Protestants are aging much faster than the Canadian population. Again, on this side of the chart, we will have the same data on each chart. If we move over to the Orthodox Church, something very different is going on here. There is a big wave of Orthodox immigration into Canada right now, and this is largely because of the instability in the Middle East and refugees and immigrants fleeing the turmoil there. And they're not aging nearly as fast as the Canadian population, and this is because they have a lot of younger refugees and immigrants coming into the country. Evangelicals, we are aging as well, but we're aging roughly in line with what you would see in the general population. We might actually be just a little bit younger. If we look at the distribution of within different traditions, so this first pie chart here looks at French Catholics, and we see that this is the percentage that are Gen Y, so 11% are of Catholics in our sample belong to Gen Y, and then we've got in blue Gen X, and then the boomers and the silent generation. That's the distribution of the people that are present. But if we look at the other chart here, that using those same people, if we look at the percentage of their attendance, we see that the silent generation, for instance, is doing much more of their attending. In fact, 76% of weekly attenders are boomers or older for French Catholics, and 33% of the silent generation or older. Why is that important? Well, the silent generation is now into their 70s, and we know that just as time takes its toll, that some of those people won't be in church, or most of those people probably won't be in church in a decade or so. Same data here for English Catholics, and you can see again that the silent generation is doing more than their share of the attendance here. But it's a little bit more positive when you look at Gen X and Gen Y. What you want to see is this slice and this slice being roughly equivalent if you've got a church that is regenerating. Here for the Catholics, 64% of weekly attenders are boomers or older, and 21% are of the silent generation or older. A bit better profile than what you would see for French-speaking Catholics. Mainline Protestants, very small slice of the pie here that are of the younger generations. A big slice in the boomer, but when we look at the attendance, the participation of the younger generation goes down even more. And this is the only one that had significant samples of what we call the greatest generation, of the very oldest, that we could talk about. 91% of weekly attenders in mainline churches are boomers or older, and 43% are of the silent generation or older. That's going to mean some huge changes for those churches. We're looking at possibly 2/5 of their regular attenders will not be in church within 10 years. Evangelicals, again, it's same data, a bit better spaced. In fact, we've got roughly these, we're sort of regenerating ourselves more or less because the different slices, whether we're looking at the distribution in the population or the attendance, everybody's sort of pulling their weight, so to speak, when it comes to attending. We've got 43% of our weekly attenders are boomers or older, and 13% are the silent generation or older. Now, we did a survey. We asked in the survey whether people had kids in the household. And what I did is I took all of that attendance data and I said, For people with kids in the household, and how often or how many days a year on average are they attending church? And here's what we found for the different traditions. When it's French Catholics, families with French Catholic families with kids in the household, they're only taking their kids to church on average about 4 times a year. For English Catholics, it's better at 16%. Mainline Protestants about 8 days, or not 16%, but 16 days. Mainline Protestants 8 times a year, and evangelicals 30 times a year. These numbers are important because if kids aren't in the church being influenced by the church, by the preaching, teaching, and the people that they meet there, it's very unlikely that that's going to become a habit or a part of their lives going forward. These numbers should be of great concern to the people in all traditions. There are 52 opportunities a year for evangelicals to be in church in most churches, and on average, those with kids in the house are only going 30 times a year. The average number of attendance days, depending on where a respondent is born. Now, this data comes out of a different data set, the Canadian Bible Engagement Study, but I used that study to look at where people are born and how often they go to church. And you can see that if someone is from Africa, and I've put the number of observations here in brackets so you can see, it's a pretty small number of observations for Africa, about 19. However, it does give you a sense of how immigrants are more likely to be in church. So the Caribbean and Central and South America, we've got 22 days, 22 times a year, Asia 22, Southeast Asia 16, Europe 11, if you're born in Canada 10, if you're born in the USA 9. Now, most of these European immigrants, of course, would have been immigrants that came to Canada quite a while ago. But you can see that where we're getting our new waves of immigration from, that they're more likely to be in church. So immigration becomes very important in terms of the vitality of the church today. Now we're going to look at the National Household Survey and find out the percentage of people in different traditions that are immigrants. Now, along the side here, in green, this is the percentage in each age group that came to Canada before 1981. In the blue, it's between 81 and 2000, and red between 2001 and 2011. And then we've got another group that are considered non-permanent residents. But you can see here that in the mainline church, only 11% of mainline affiliates are immigrants, and 67% of these arrived in Canada before 1981. So the immigrants that they have been in Canada for in most cases for a long time. If we look at Catholics, same data here, you can see that 15% of Catholic affiliates are immigrants, and 42% of these arrived in Canada before 1981. That means that, of course, that 58% have arrived since 1981. For evangelical affiliates, we've got 24% of evangelical affiliates are immigrants, and 26% of these arrived in Canada before 1981. That means that in the evangelical churches in Canada, there are a lot of new Canadians. In fact, the percentage of immigrants in the evangelical churches in Canada is greater than what you would find, just a little bit greater than what you'd find in the Canadian population generally. Now, I've kept all of this set of slides to the same scale, and you can see that when we look at Orthodox Christians, that their bars take up a huge percentage of the scale. And what this simply reflects is the mass current immigration. They're not numerically much smaller in Canada, but of their community, a greater percent are immigrants. In fact, 57% of Orthodox affiliates are immigrants, and only 30% of these arrived in Canada before 1981. That means 70% of their immigrants have come to Canada since 1981. I'm going to go through this next a little bit more quickly. We're getting sort of to the end of this. I want to introduce this idea of a Christian evangelical scale. We have talked about evangelicals according to affiliation, and that's one of the ways that we identify evangelicals. We say that they belong to an evangelical church, therefore you're an evangelical. Another way is to look at beliefs and behaviors, and there are four sort of distinctive emphases that evangelicals have. They are biblicism, activism, conversionism, crucicentrism. These are, of course, things that we share in common with all Christians to some extent, but there's a peculiar emphasis on the authority of the Bible. On activism, this includes both evangelism and looking after the poor and vulnerable. We've got conversionism, that's a belief that everyone needs to make a decision for Christ. And then crucicentrism, that's the centrality of the preaching of the cross. So what we did is we took those emphases, or rather Andrew Granville of Angus Reid took those emphases, and he developed a scale that asked roughly 2 questions per emphasis. And I've given some short form versions here, whether God is a superstition or not, whether Jesus was raised from the dead, whether there's forgiveness through Jesus, whether Jesus is God or not, about the authority and trustworthiness of the Bible, place of evangelism, whether you're a converted Christian, and then finally attendance. And all of these questions, you could get a possible score of 1 to 4. So even if you gave the most unevangelical answer, you still got 1. So the lowest score you could get out of on the scale is 8, 1 for each question, and the highest score that you could get is 32. And we've developed a number of ranges as a way to describe these. So if you scored in the very highest range, we have this terminology that you can be evangelically aligned. And we say evangelically aligned instead of evangelical for an important reason. We found that there were people in all Christian traditions who believe and behave like evangelicals, and yet we wouldn't necessarily call them evangelicals. And so then we further subdivided that group into those that we call strongly evangelically aligned, and these are the people that show up consistently in evangelical churches week after week. Moderately evangelically aligned, and then on the other side we have those that are evangelically unaligned, and you can see that it's a much bigger swathe of the possible scores that you can get. And then we have the moderately unaligned and the strongly unaligned as well. Why do we show this? Because the evangelical alignment is another way to find evangelicals in Canada. So by different measures, 10 to 12% of Canadians, well, even up to, as we can see, up to about a fifth of Canadians at different times have been considered evangelical or evangelically aligned. And you can see here that we use the scale to find those that are evangelically aligned in 96, 2003, and 2013 and 2014. And you can see that there was a bit of a bump here in 2003, but then it has fallen off. And so currently there's about 13% of the Canadian population would be considered evangelically aligned. That means they have beliefs and behaviors that are consistent with being an evangelical. And of those, about 5% or 1 in 20 is considered strongly aligned. And again, I want to point out that here's this dip here somewhere between 2003 and 2013 where there was something that happened in the Canadian culture that has caused not just this score but all kinds of measures to change very rapidly. What's the distribution of evangelical alignment by a group? Here we've got our different generations, and you can see in 1996 we had the greatest generation there, but they weren't part of the sample by and large by 2013. And you can see that in 1996, the older you were, the more likely you were to be evangelically aligned. That is still true to some extent in 2013, but there's less difference between the generations. And again, the other part of the story here is up here where you've got a big group here that is increasingly saying that they are strongly unaligned. How has that alignment changed? I'm going to go through this very quickly, but I just want to say that between 1996 and 2013, the percentage of people in other denominational traditions that were evangelically aligned has fallen off dramatically, where it has strengthened a little bit for evangelicals. That's probably because to be identified as an evangelical today, there's a little bit of a social cost to that, and so those that are willing to pay that cost are more likely to be committed. And I believe we're getting to the end of the slides here. Um, what this slide shows is the distribution of all those possible scores. And so this line here represents the boundary for evangelical alignment. So if you're on this side, we say that you're evangelically aligned. If you're on this side, we say you're evangelically unaligned. The different colors represent the traditions. They're the same colors that we've been using: blue for Catholics, and red for mainline Protestants, green for evangelicals, and then orange for other. I want to show you how this has changed over time. The next slide shows the transition to 2003. And you can see that it seems a bit of a strengthening. If we go to 2013, look at the whole thing has kind of shifted back here to be a very strong negative, negative in terms of their beliefs and behaviors being like evangelicals. A big shift to strongly evangelically unaligned. That is the presentation. I open it up to some questions. Be happy to take and field your questions now. I know we've gone through that pretty quickly. There's a lot in there. What I want you to think about is, what is this going to mean going forward for the church? We can see that the church is aging. In many cases, we can see that that attendance is very different over the traditions. But what kinds of concerns, and what do you see? Does this reflect what you are seeing in your church? Okay, we've got our first question here. What do you attribute the significant drop in church attendance among evangelicals? The drop in church attendance among evangelicals has been slighter than what you've seen in other traditions, but it is still significant. I think that there's a number of things. One is the amount of time that people have to put into working, and sort of the busyness of people's lives. I want to talk a little bit also about this transition between 2003 and 2013 that I keep mentioning. There is something that's very significant that has happened, and if we had more time, I could have showed you charts about belief, um, uh, about beliefs of people that have changed in that same time period. Some of the change, I think, that may have happened, there's some guesses, but I think that one of the changes that happened in that time period is the introduction of smartphones, things like this. We have, as a culture, I think, have moved to sort of an ethic of autonomy, and this is one of the things that has made it more plausible that I can live an autonomous life without the aid of anybody else, because I have this digital assistant that can help me. Another thing that some people have suggested is the effect of the last recession, where people had sort of a doubling down to sort of look after their house and to keep it in order, and they didn't have the time to be in church. Some of it is that people are simply working more, or they're spending their time in other places. There was a general social survey in 2005, and it said that the typical Canadian only spends 20 minutes a week in a place of worship. Now, that's probably less today, but it's also less time than Canadians typically spend in a grocery store in the average week. Got another question here. What's the impact of immigration between 2003 and 2013? I don't know if I can answer that question generally, other than to say that that immigrants continue to come into Canada with an evangelical affiliation, and I think that they're renewing the church. I was just in a conversation with someone who's writing an article on this for Faith Today, and what we found is that there's at least one new African denomination in Canada that has over 100 congregations, and this is as big as some of the congregations that we would think of as some of the denominations we would think of as some of the more established denominations. And you're finding a lot of new African denominations, Asians setting up new denominations, and South Americans, and they tend, for the most part, to be smaller denominations, but they are sort of flying under the radar in some cases because they may not have charitable numbers and they may not have big denominational structures, but there is new life there. Got another question here. How much of the shift may be the result of more nuns, but less stigma for being a nun? Um, that's a good question, Steve. Certainly in society in the past, there was if you want to say a desirability bias, there was a social benefit to being in church. And there may have been people that would have identified with a Christian tradition because of the social benefit, not necessarily because of the beliefs that went along with that affiliation. And certainly that may be working in the opposite direction right now. What we can say is that people are less reticent, if there was some of that going on, to identify as a nun now. And there may actually be a social stigma along with identifying with a Christian denomination. What can Christian higher education do in the light of these data? I think Christian higher education can't do, Christian higher education needs to be working with churches. This isn't something that either churches can solve or Christian higher education can solve on their own, I don't think. I think it's something that they're going to have to do in partnership with each other. Some of the changes that are happening, like the shift to a radical autonomy ethic, that is really shaping. So when I say that, way it manifests itself in people's lives is they say, I'm going to make this decision, and this is not your decision to be made. And so there's sort of a refusal to submit themselves to any groups or places in society. And there's much more of an emphasis on sort of knowing who I really am, as opposed to finding that identity in any group. Um, and we don't really have a lot of good teaching right now. And I think what we need to do, both for Christian higher education and in the church, is recover a kind of a theology of the human person. And I think that this is sort of underlying a lot of the weaknesses that we're seeing in the church right now, that we don't really have a good operative theology of the human person. And I think that were we to do that, both in our Christian higher education institutions, but it needs to be reinforced and within the church as well, that we can help people to embrace a more biblical understanding of the human person. One here, any indications of how wealth has affected the changes in the 2003, 2013 numbers? The data doesn't speak to it directly, but one of the suggestions that we've had is that people sort of overextended themselves in the run-up to, debt-wise, in the run-up to the 2008 recession. And then they found that in order to stay solvent, they needed to put more of their income towards maintaining their debt and making sure that they kept up with those commitments, and that drew them out of the church. Though that's speculation. There's nothing in the numbers per se that speaks to that directly, though. So that's purely speculation. Got one here. 2003, 2013 may line up with the change in the definition of marriage, and the fact that Scripture doesn't line up with social reality. In that data, we saw sort of a bit of a evangelical scale rally in the lead up to 2003. That 2003 data point was done right in the midst of the same-sex marriage debate in Canada. And it is a theory, and again, it is just a theory, that there was a bit of a rally there, but that when the law was changed, that people quickly started to accommodate themselves to the new reality so that they didn't have that tension with society over it. Uh, and that may be one of the reasons. Again, uh, you in your own experience may have other reasons, and I encourage people to be talking about it. The data is pretty clear, though, that there has been a very rapid shift just in the last number of years in the way that people think about faith and religion and the way that they're responding to church. I've got one here. I know you ran out of time, but can't help think that there may be some clues as to why these shifts are occurring in the belief stats. Are you able to summarize those findings in that regard? Well, I did run out of time, but I'll say this. One of the shifts that we saw in the belief stats that was different, say, from the data that we would have in 1996 is that when you ask people a question about Jesus, they're far more likely to say they just don't know or they don't have an opinion. And this is new. It's sort of in the order of 15 to 20% of the people you ask a theological question for, and they won't even try to make an answer. And that tells you something about the level of disengagement with religious communities, that it's so much not part of their lives that they're not even reacting, where maybe parents who, and this is mostly young people, maybe where their parents had reacted against a church upbringing or a Christian upbringing. Now you've got people that it's just not part of their world, where they feel that they have a place to be able to answer those questions. One here, regarding the original immigration question, do we have an understanding of the number of non-Christian immigrants entering Canada in the years previously mentioned? There's still the majority of immigrants into Canada, or the plurality of immigrants into Canada have a Christian affiliation of some kind or other. I would have to look at this a little bit more closely to give an answer, but there are still the biggest portion of the immigrants coming into Canada still have a Christian religious affiliation. Now, there is a growth, although, in the percentage of those immigrants coming into Canada that have no religious affiliation at all as well. Um, does the reflection on the downturn in church attendance over the last decade indicate a lack of discipleship and mentoring of the older towards the younger? That's a good question. You know, there's likely many reasons why you have the downturn. Some of it is no doubt the social desirability. Some of it will be internal church changes. Some of it will be changes in society generally. Um, what the data suggests, though, and I'm just going to go back to that slide about the number of times that people with young kids in the house attend church, and really that's sort of the upper limit usually on how many times their kids attend church. We know that church makes a difference in people's lives because it's there that they get challenged with the Word of God, they get challenged to give, they get challenged to volunteer. They have people that get in their face and ask them about, how is it with your soul? And that kind of interaction changes people. It is a very different thing. And one of the other great things about church is you get all this practice with long suffering, right? Having to deal with those difficult people and to figure out what it means to forgive them, to be long suffering, and to practice all of the fruits of the Spirit. It changes the kind of people that you are. If you don't have kids in church with those opportunities, and those are often some of the very kinds of negative things that people say I sort of flee from church in order to avoid. But if you don't have that, both for the negative and the positive things, then we know that religious service attendance becomes a bit like a habit. By the time people become young adults, they tend to develop life habits, and if church going isn't part of that, then they tend to just keep doing what they're doing unless they have an experience with God or something that jolts them into a different pattern. And so I would say that for the church traditions where kids are getting to church, a handful of times a year, that doesn't look very good for the long-term prospects of those traditions. One here, from my observation as an immigrant, the desire of the evangelical church about God and the things of God has declined, and this reflects the various graphs that you have shown. Yes, I think certainly there is a gap between what you would see for church attendance and different measures of orthodoxy for those that were born outside of Canada versus those that were born inside of Canada. We know from our youth and young adult research that if you had one parent that was born outside of Canada, just one, you were twice as likely to be in church as a young adult than someone who had both parents that were born in Canada. There is something about our culture here in Canada that works against faith. Um, and that's something for us to talk about in Canada. We need to figure out what that is. If there is this cultural corrosion, if you will, that works against faith, we need to be identifying what that is and how do we help our kids to engage with their culture, engage productively with their schools and places of higher education and their societies in a way um, that helps them to deal with those challenges that come with the culture. I would say this too, that for those that are new to Canada, they offer a perspective that the church that has been in Canada for a longer period of time, that we really need that challenge, because sometimes you tend to look at your current situation and you wonder, is this is probably, you think this is probably the way it's always been, even even if that's not true. And to bring that challenge to the churches, I think, is something that we desperately need. Are there any other questions? Well, if there aren't any other questions, I want to thank you for your time. We will be doing some more of these webinars at different points. There's more data and more things to talk about. If you're interested in learning more about the EFC, you can find us on the website at www.theefc.ca, and that should be appearing on your screen. I want to thank you for your time. I'd be pleased to talk with any of you offline afterwards about any of these questions, and you can probably find some contact information for me on the website, or you can simply give us a call at the number that you find on the screen. Thank you very much.